Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Warcraft II review for Warcraft II, probably the best Warcraft RTS game or Warcraft game in general, but that doesn't mean it's good. And to join me to discuss this very important point is Dynamo. What's up, dude?
Yes, Master.
So
I'm here. I'm ready, Master.
Can you believe?
I'm ready to discuss this game.
Can you believe that this game took us this long to beat? That's the first question I gotta levy at you.
And well, when it comes to this review, I guess it would be fair to distinguish between the original game and the expansion, which was made by a different company.
Yeah,
it was basically outsourced to, as far as we know, it's basically Aztec New Media who made it. Like, even if that's not the case, like that is forever what we will think about it.
It has the same sort of design philosophy as you saw in Retribution or Insurrection. So yeah, I guess I can see where you're coming from when you draw comparisons for sure.
Yeah. So, well, to start off, the game, of course, is very old. It was pretty much one of the first RTS games ever. It was pretty much the first RTS I played as well. I don't remember if it was that one or Red Alert 1. Red Alert 1 and this game came out at around the same time. And there wasn't really no competition back then. Like, apart from Dune 2, which is a much more primitive game, and Warcraft 1, which itself is way more primitive than this. This was, of course, the beginning of the RTS era, so to speak. So, naturally, a lot of ideas were not yet fully ironed out. A lot of concepts were not yet fully realized. There's like a lack of a lot of quality of life changes. Like, there's no unit queuing. There is no waypoints like for buildings, like rally points. So there's a lot of that. But then, like, obviously we can forgive these things for such an old game. But then there's stuff like the level design problems, especially in the expansion, but also sometimes in the original game as well, which should come as no surprise, as the levels were designed by Metzen himself. Apparently, at least that's what Wikipedia claimed. I don't know if he did like 50-50, like he did one campaign and another guy, probably Bill Roper, did the other one. I don't know that, but either way, the level design definitely has some issues. But at least, like, mechanically, like as you said in one of the earlier streams, the game has a definitive improvement, not only over the first title, but also over the subsequent Warcraft titles. That is Warcraft 3 and Frozen Throne. So I don't know, like, can you discuss about that? Like, what do you think about that? Like, mechanically, how do you think the game compares to those two?
Well, the thing is, this game is actually trying to be an RTS, and they seem to have focused, when they were talking about the design of the underlying systems, they seem to have focused on trying to make an RTS. They certainly didn't succeed in making an engaging RTS product when it comes to single-player experience, but the game has multiplayer, and the game certainly has more of an RTS to it, more RTS mechanics in play, and less other mechanics in play than Warcraft 3. And so, you compare it to Warcraft 1, it's obviously superior in that regard, just because of the fact that it takes the existing systems and it improves them, makes them more usable. Certainly, we still can't queue, we still can't rally, we still don't have the ability to queue even orders, let alone units. So there's a lot of stuff missing from what you would eventually see in later RTS titles. But at the same time, it's better than Warcraft 1 by leaps and bounds, although the pathfinding seems to have regressed a little bit in certain situations, which is very, very bad. But when it comes to comparing it to Warcraft 3, there's only favorable comparisons to draw. Literally nothing in Warcraft 3 is remotely close to maintaining the illusion that it is meant to be an RTS, because of course the RPG elements take away from that, the long time to kill, the insanely glacial pacing of battles, that takes away from it. The fact that your upkeep system prevents you from really building large armies or supporting multiple bases, and the fact that the economy system, the resource harvesting, is much more simplified than what you would expect out of a generic RTS, just your everyday RTS game, because of the way that workers are always protected in the gold mine for much longer than in Warcraft 2, notably. All these elements sort of combine to make a very ugly end product, not just visually, of course, but also in terms of how it sort of defines itself.
How it feels.
Yeah, how it defines itself as far as its gameplay loop is concerned. And then those are exacerbated by level design issues and AI issues on an individual level, which of course Warcraft 2 also suffers from. Warcraft 2 has some of the most abhorrent level design and AI that you're going to find in games of its era, and certainly games of its genre. And so that sort of comes away. I mean, I think it sort of transcends the idea that your it's just an RTS issue. I think it's a global issue in video games that AI tends to be non-engaging, and the only time that they can beat you is when the engagements are weighted so far in their favor through raw numbers, like pre-placed units, or in like a shooter damage values or health values. And so what you get out of games like Warcraft 2 is a very disengaged experience. So even when the missions were quote unquote difficult, it was because of tedium. It was because you had to find the solution to the puzzle more than you had to find strategy that would work against the AI's personality. Like those words literally don't even mean anything in Warcraft 2 because there's nothing you can compare to. There's nothing you can say, oh yeah, the strategy and personality of an enemy, that is going to change how my playstyle, like I'm going to have to adapt it to their playstyle. There's no such thing. It's just default scripts in the expansion campaign, as far as we can tell, as well as very similar environments when it comes down to the original campaigns. So I don't actually know what the AI looks like on the back end. I don't have any experience with this game. In fact, the first time I was playing this game was for this stream. I never played Warcraft 2 before this, so that is worth noting. Perhaps some of the technical details that I will cite as they are indeed just assumptions based on what other people have told me and what my own experience with the title is and what my experience with other RTS titles tends to be. But
right,
generally speaking, I don't think it's a good game. I don't think it's a good game, but I do think it's way better than the other Warcraft titles. So that's why I sort of referenced that at the beginning. And unfortunately, that's just in terms of the base idea of the game. Like how, if the AI and the level design wasn't just ass backwards and wasn't in service to puzzle gimmick stuff as opposed to actually making something that worked, and something that engaged the player and something that challenged them to become better at playing the game holistically, not just solving some QTE puzzle. If that were the case, then Warcraft 2 would be a much better game, hands down, than many of the other RTSs of its genre. Perhaps even better than StarCraft in that sense, because of the fact that StarCraft's levels are the same way, even though it has a much superior game state. So the game state of Warcraft 2 is fine, is serviceable, certainly missing some mechanics, but the level design tends to be, I would say, on a relative scale compared to its game state, it's probably just as bad as Warcraft 3. Like Warcraft 3 has a much worse game state and also much worse level design. But the degree to which the level design interacts and intercepts the ability for the player to express their skill is probably the same. So I don't know what you make of that.
Yeah, well, again, for the most part, the QTUs were mostly in the expansion as opposed to the first game, which actually brings me to an interesting comparison. Whereas in the original game, we actually had, we oftentimes complained about the terrible placement of the town hall, which was always located so far away from the resources for seemingly no reason apart from pissing off the player. Whereas in the expansion, we always complained about not having a fucking base to start off with, which is actually something that, we wanted to see in the original game. Like the argument being that if they're gonna give it as such a shitty base layout, then they may as well just let us build the base from the beginning, which is what happened in the expansion. But that was on top of endless quick time events, which honestly just made me prefer the shitty town hall placement of the original game.
Yeah, no
so
kidding.
Discussing the levels a little bit, I would say that overall, the original game obviously had way better levels, even if they were by no means amazing. At least they made an effort to, offer some different playstyles at times. Like you had maps where you had to expand on several islands to collect several resources, and you had to fight an AI that was mostly naval and another one that was mostly ground units. And you had to carefully manage your resources, especially in the human campaign, whereas the orc campaign was way more linear. Like it had generally only one AI opponent throughout most of the maps for some reason, whereas the human campaign was a little bit more interesting in that regard. But I guess the main challenge for the human missions and the orc mission as well was resource starvation, in that you had a lot of expansions, but many of them didn't really last very long at all. Whereas in some of the expansion missions, actually, there was a definitive lack of expansions available. That there were no gold mines to find apart from the ones you had to steal from your enemy in the beginning of the quick time event. So that is definitely one area where the original game is superior, even though the resource starvation and the town hall placement was annoying. And so I would say that for the time, like the level design in Warcraft 2 for the original game, especially the human campaign, at least it set some positive standards. It had some interesting ideas that could have been further developed in future titles for the genre to be made into pretty decent missions. Of course, that didn't never happen in the Warcraft franchise because, as we know, they actually started doing anime for some reason. But I guess the overbearing briefings in the expansion kind of paved the way for that, in that they really had a much bigger focus on pointless story over anything else.
Oh, it's interesting you mentioned that, because it's pretty much the same shit that happened in StarCraft. If you remember, the expansion story is much worse than the vanilla games, which is not that special anyway, but you compare the two and it's
more to the point usually.
Yeah. It's much more about, like, what is actually happening, much more grounded in the events of the here and now, whereas the expansion deals in much more loftier, more heady concepts without actually having the intelligence behind the writers and the writing to sell those concepts in the first place, which is basically the same issue turned up to 11 when it comes to the sequels. So that tends to be an interesting thing that we can look at with Blizzard's track record. We can say, yeah, it seems to be a pattern here. You guys start out with something that's relatively basic and simple and leaves a lot to be desired, but within the confines of a simple story seems to be okay, at the very least. Certainly nothing special and doesn't inspire as much confidence in your ability to present concepts. But, I don't immediately call into question your ability to write concepts, because you seem to be using basic ones okay. You're just not presenting them as well as you could. Whereas, obviously, as soon as we roll into Warcraft 3 and I guess the expansions of Warcraft 2 to some degree, the writing gets thrown out the window, because they go for the reinventing the wheel idea without actually knowing how the wheel is made in the first place, without demonstrating mastery over the wheel. They try to make something that's better than it. So it just goes back to people not understanding how to design stories for a strategy game, for a video game in the first place, let alone an RTS, which is not really where you should be trying to tell a really deep and societally penetrating story, or whatever the fuck they're going for, where they're trying to be much more.
That is really literally what they're going for. Overly dramatic space opera or fantasy opera or whatever the fuck.
Right.
That is pretty much what they were trying to do. Like, I'm pretty sure someone said, I don't know if it was Max, but someone said that it's basically just the insane writings that they did for fan fiction back in high school, and then they later reuse it for their video games. I can actually believe that, because that's literally what it feels like in terms of quality.
Well, Fagudo was talking about custom campaigns and said basically the same thing. It seems to be a sentiment that's spread out across the entirety of my audience, where they just recognize that Blizzard themselves, recently the whole BlizzCon thing happened recently, and of course you probably only saw whatever people were posting about, but there was a World of Warcraft expansion announcement, and it was the same regurgitated fanfiction nonsense that they've been pissing out for the past however long that game has been around for. So it's again, it doesn't inspire any confidence. It's interesting to look at this game that's obviously we've played it now very, very recently, and then so far ago is when it was released, and yet we're still finding issues with the company that made it and the people that were involved in it. Their track record bore out a very unflattering picture of their talent and their abilities and their discipline and their passion. They don't look very good, and they don't have they're not shown in a great light after all these years following the game's release. But as far as the game story goes, like we were talking about, it's pretty much basic at the beginning, and not maybe a little bit more over the top than Warcraft 1, but still sort of tongue in cheek. And then the expansion seems to try to get a little bit more serious without really establishing why we should take it seriously. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. There is no reason for anyone to take it seriously, especially with the fucking names the Plains of the Damned, the Valley of the Infidel. I don't know what fucking names they had for all these places, like the Dark Mountain. They had some really stupid names going on.
Yeah, even the names of people in general were there was, I don't know, Black. It's Deathwing. There you go. What the fuck? I don't know. Just these names are ridiculous, and I know that they exist as characters later on in World of Warcraft or Warcraft 3 or whatever, but it's it's not a good look, man.
Yeah, but talking a bit about the game state, comparing it to Warcraft 1 in particular. Warcraft 1, the main unit to use was, there were pretty much two units that you could use every time. The first one was the Archer, which was useful in the early game. And then the second one was the spawn-in elemental unit, which basically made it so that you didn't need to play the game anymore, as you just basically had to wait for mana and then use those super overpowered units to overpower the enemy, which could never match up to you when it comes to using those units properly. And in Warcraft 2, they definitely changed the way the gameplay works completely in that regard. In that now you do have a little bit more emphasis on regular fighting, even though the units are not very well balanced. For example, archers are. I appreciate that they're not the main unit to use now, and you have to rely on melee units now. But at the same time, I feel like they're way too weak in most situations, especially against other ground units like ogres or whatever. They're pretty much only useful when it comes to killing dragons. And I feel like again, it is good that they moved away from the style of gameplay that Warcraft 1 had, but I feel like they definitely should have polished some of the units to make them much more usable, especially the archer, but also the dragons. The archer main issue is that sometimes it takes way too long to acquire a target, which would be fine if it dealt a little bit more damage, but since the damage it deals is very, very low, you expect it to be a more responsive unit instead of just sitting there and doing nothing. Like, this is actually a common sight. If the enemy actually is raiding your economy, what usually happens is the units like ogres or grunts can actually kill your peasants, but sometimes the archer just sit there because they basically target a peasant that's going into a mine, and then they lose track of that peasant, and so they start targeting another one, but that other one also goes into the mine, so they just basically sit there and do nothing. You've definitely seen this at least a few times in the campaign, if you remember. And it's a big issue when it comes to using archers in particular. And also, there's stuff like the dragons and the griffins, because as we know, the factions are mirrored, which really are, because they take up a lot of space and they're really unresponsive. They have a cooldown of sorts when after they attack, that you can actually move them around, which makes them very finicky to work with. So I feel like overall it's a definitive improvement over the first title, but some units definitely should have had a way better, I want to say, programming behind them. They're just not very functional when it comes to controls, which definitely is made worse by the famous spinning maneuver that the AI was very effectively using throughout most of the campaigns. So overall, I feel like they had some good concept, but the controls definitely held it back, as well as the AI spinning maneuver and other insanity. And the other main thing, and the thing I really dislike about the game overall, is its spell mechanics. Basically, the late game revolves a lot around using spells, and the AI is always going to use them much more effectively than you are. And so fights against enemy paladins or enemy ogres just turn into cancers. You're never going to be able to use bloodlust or healing at the same level that they are. And even if you were doing that, like, it's such an insane usage of APM that it's just annoying to do. Yeah. All just to heal your fucking unit. Like, it's just it's not something that feels as rewarding as, I don't know, a brutaling spawn or a lockdown or something like that, or even a nuke. Like if you use your spells properly in StarCraft, it's way more reasonable and way more effective on the immediate, like on the short term, basically, than just using healing, which is something that you have to use constantly in order for it to be effective, essentially. So yeah. I think these are the main issues when it comes to the game state for the game. I don't know if you agree with this or if you have any other things that stick out to you.
Yeah, I think speaking specifically on the spells, one of the biggest issues with the game is the fact that its spells are they revolve around pushing a button to get a benefit immediately, no questions asked. Yes, you can heal a better unit or pick your targets better, or you can show some skill by bloodlusting units that are closer or in the middle of combat as opposed to bloodlusting before to get like the maximum amount of utility out of the spell or whatever. But what it comes down to is you're pushing a button, you're getting a benefit. You're pushing a button, you're dealing more damage or healing or whatever the benefit actually is. And I think that you're always going to have AI that micro better than the player, just by virtue of the fact that they'll never get tired. They're always going to execute their commands. That's not going to be a concern for the AI. They're never in a position where they feel like they have to worry about something like that. So rather than try to put an APM cap or do any other weird shit to try to stop the AI from operating at that kind of level of efficiency, you should just design your game state so that being like spammy with your APM and casting shit on cooldown or whatever, ideally you won't have cooldowns, but that, casting your shit on cooldown and or whenever the mana is up or whatever, make it so that that's not enough to win. Make it so that that's not enough to be executing it as in as skilled a fashion as possible. Warcraft 2, the only way you can get better at using the spells, really the virtually the only way I should say, because again there is some target selection that comes to mind, but for the most part, it's just actually being able to click the buttons and the mouse clicks and doing so in the right order every single time. And the most you can be like an AI in that respect, the better you are. That's not really how you should be doing it. You should be designing positional abilities and behaviors that reward players for proper strategy as well as proper mechanical execution, so that they can do some pre-planning, or they can understand the victory conditions for using their abilities, which is the motivation behind reworking all the abilities in Hydra in the first place for my own work, as well as the position that I come from when I do critique spells. I do critique unit abilities, that even critiquing basic weapons, like for example the dragons and the griffins, the way that they attack, and the fact that the ships also suffer from similar pathfinding issues because of the fact that they're bigger than one square on the grid. Like, these are basically bugs as far as I'm concerned. It's a bug that my dragon just sits there doing nothing after I tell him to attack, sometimes not even attacking, let alone moving after the fact. It's a bug as far as I'm concerned that the ships just sit there spinning up against the side of the shore. Like, maybe it's actually intended that this happens. I would expect that it isn't, but from my perspective, like, it does not feel good to use. It does not feel rewarding to use, and that's another more maybe potentially subjective element of the analysis. But for me, I think if your units are unresponsive, that's a critique against them.
It's a bad way to nerf them. Essentially, I think that's really the key here. Like, I don't know if you agree with this, but if you have a unit that's like, if you feel like the dragon is way too powerful, I don't think making it awkward to use is going to fix it. Essentially, it's just going to make it annoying.
Yeah, I mean, there's some shit related to that with certain units in StarCraft, for example, the Dragoon and the Goliath. Like, these units have difficulty pathfinding and some stuff. And turreted units in general have really poor unit AI, even when controlled by a player, or especially when controlled by a player sometimes. So, like, this isn't... Like, I'm not saying that StarCraft is free for this either, because of course a lot of people who prefer other games to StarCraft and know that I like StarCraft tend to use that as an attack against me. They say, well, look at this, it happens in StarCraft 2. Yeah, it's bad there too. Like, that doesn't mean that it's better. The issue with Warcraft specifically, or Warcraft 2 specifically, is that you end up having this issue where, in order to be good, you have to be like an AI instead of just being like a thoughtful player. And yes, mechanical execution is part of being good in an RTS, or should be part of being good in an RTS, but that shouldn't be the only place where you can express your skill. You should also be able to just plan your battles better and take smarter engagements and position your forces better. And there is some element of mechanical skill that comes down to messing with positioning as well, but obviously an AI doesn't even do that, and they were still kicking my ass most of the time just because they spammed heals or they spammed bloodlust and got extra DPS or effectiveness out of that because of the fact that their units lasted longer, or they were literally dealing like 5 extra damage per hit or whatever. And so yeah, that really rubbed me the wrong way. The fact that the only way that I could be good at the end of the day is by clicking faster and more accurately, instead of being able to say, well, I can use these abilities in a more positional manner. The closest thing they had to that was probably the runes, but I don't know. I've never seen the AI use those against me, so I don't even know what those look like as far as playing against them. And when you place them down, it's not really that rewarding to then have to lure your units in, because the AI is not very proactive. So using them against AI, I most of the time use them in static environments where I knew that I was walking into an area where there's going to be enemies, so I placed it down and then lured them in. And that was obviously not very exciting, not very entertaining, because that's just tedium by virtue of the map design.
Right. Yeah, and I guess one other thing we can discuss when it comes to the game state is some of the concepts that the game employed, which I would say were not very successful, and in fact they were abandoned in all subsequent RTS titles. So I guess this in itself already speaks about how much of a failure they are. Well, one of them is, of course, oil, like the concept of oil, like the fact that you have this resource that's water-bound, which might not be a bad thing in itself. The fact that you can harvest resources on water, if you have naval units, it kind of makes sense. But the fact that it is a unique resource means that if you actually run out of oil and the enemy has a monopoly on oil, that means that it is pretty much impossible to ever get back on the water, because the enemy is going to be able to fill submarines. And even if you manage to get a secure part of the shoreline, like in a faraway island or whatever that the enemy isn't even aware of, like in a PvP game, for example, I don't know, you still will not be able to get ships going because the enemy has control over all the old platforms. So like that is a really really backwards way of doing resources to me. I guess it would have made a bit more sense if you were able to harvest gold through the oil platforms. I don't know if that would have made much sense. Like you were basically harvesting oil, selling it for gold. Like
yeah, that's what I was going to suggest too. And I think we talked about this during one of the segments that we were dealing with the naval mission. But I 100% agree. I think if you just converted it to basically an aquatic gold mine, that would have been fine. I think.
Yeah, and another thing that hasn't really seen much success, I guess, although it's actually used in Warcraft 3 as well in some situations, is the fact that you sometimes need to break rocks and trees using the fucking demo squads for some reason. Like,
well, they use that in Warcraft 3 a lot.
Yeah, that's actually used for trees. Like you can use goblins or catapults to do that, and sometimes you need to. But like in Warcraft 2, it seemed especially pointless. There were a few missions where you literally had to do it at the beginning for no reason. Like you start off with a single demo squad, and you use that to break away a piece of rock that's preventing you from building a base. Like, what is the point of that?
Yeah,
it's a quick time event that's not even quick or an event. There's nothing. There's no reason why that should be in. It's just like there were some situations where you actually use this to your advantage, like in the final orc mission, for example, for the expansion, where you actually landed a single demo squad and managed to breach away into the enemy base, from which it was much easier to attack them. But honestly, that almost seemed like a bug. Like they didn't even consider like the fact that you could be able to land the demo squad in there, because for the most part, you're actually not able to do that.
Yeah,
like
most of the time there's no space.
Yeah. In the final human mission of the original campaign, which has a similar setup with a huge enemy base surrounded by rocks, you're actually not able to do that. Which I guess means that Metzen really put in more effort into making sure that these missions were as infuriating as possible, whereas the Aztec new media guys really didn't care too much.
Yeah, they didn't feel like testing.
Yeah, like I feel like these elements really... Again, I appreciate experimentation, even though like oftentimes you kind of need a reason to experiment. You need a reason to break with tradition, because doing it just for the sake of doing it obviously is pointless. Like you need an actual reasoning behind it. Like I'm doing that because I expect that my changes are going to improve the base experience significantly. But if you're just gonna do that for the sake of doing it, like if you're gonna if you're gonna turn your fucking RTS into an anime campaign for the sake of being different, then that's obviously stupid. But in this case, I guess they didn't really want to... Like, it wasn't really changes that were bad, like, conceptually. They just were poorly implemented and eventually just didn't work out with the rest of the game, or the genre, I should say. So, like, I'm not gonna crucify them for that, but at the same time, I do think they were failures as mechanics. I don't know if you agree with this.
Yeah. I think, just sort of like the experimentation that we discussed in some of the earlier Command & Conquer titles, where they messed around with a bunch of naval stuff. I think naval combat in RTS games is a failed experiment in and of itself. I'm not sure why it endures in games like Red Alert and Warcraft 2, but for sure the concept ends up falling apart almost always. And in Red Alert 3, they tried to solve this by just turning aquatic, like having units be able to form switch between aquatic and air or aquatic and ground. And at that point, you might as well not have a fucking ocean. Like, it doesn't even make sense to even have that. So you can see where, like, people are struggling to figure out how to make it not feel like a gimmick and not feel like a wasted investment after the water stuff is used up. And you can either do it by having really boring level design where every single mission has a lot of water, or you can do it by making all units or many units able to form switch between water and some other form, so that they aren't completely useless after the fact that you've invested in them, which again is just, you might as well not have any water units at that point, because you're making it so that it's not even dedicated to this particular ground. So in that particular case, I think Navy in general is a failed experiment, and one that obviously Blizzard never really tried again, although they do have some naval units in Warcraft 3. They're restricted to campaign-only environments.
They actually made it even worse there, believe it or not, which is really impressive. And was actually very well showcased in the Arcane mission, which you had naval combat, which just revolved around a billion pre-placed ships that you had to kill. That was really...
And then they dropped you to attack you instead of actually using boats, which is nice, because AI can't do it.
Yeah. But, like, that's those are the failed features. Like, also another improvement they actually did in Warcraft 3 was make each 3 its sort of HP, so to speak, instead of just having the insanity that is 3 chopping in this game, where sometimes you get 2 peasants chopping in the same tree and then only one of them gets the resources, which is a lot of wasted resource harvesting time.
Oh yeah, that's something I almost forgot to mention, is the AI in this game for workers is pretty bad still. Like Warcraft 1 has that issue where as soon as a lumber harvester gets tickled, they run away, and this also extends to gold workers in that game. Now when they're returning gold, I think that still happens, and when they're chopping or returning lumber, that still happens, but when they're actually going towards the gold mine, and they at least don't run away. Of course, the AI doesn't suffer from this problem in any capacity in Warcraft 1 or in Warcraft 2, I don't think. So,
in Warcraft 1, they just have infinite resources anyway.
Well, what I mean is that they literally don't have their workers do not respond to being attacked in Warcraft 1. In Warcraft 2, I think they actually do try to run away a little bit, but most of the time, they either have nigh unlimited resources in many missions in Warcraft 1 and 2, or they run out after a certain amount of time, like they run out of trees or something. And I almost feel like that's a bug where like they forgot to put the trigger in to give them extra money or something. But at the same time, I'm going to take what I can get, because it would have been way more intolerable if I couldn't attrition them out in certain aspects. And that is another thing that I wanted to mention regarding the naval stuff, but also regarding some of the other things that you said, is all of these failed experimental gimmicks that they did with like the sapper squads, the demo squads, and the oil and all this other stuff. The AI does not handle it very well at all. Like the AI does actually use naval units to its credit in some of these missions, but at the end of the day, you wipe out their shipyards and their transports. They don't rebuild them. They don't try to make it so that the AI, like that, they can reclaim the waters. They can still have oil platforms and still have oil in their reserves, and have plenty of resources with which to rebuild their shit, and they just never rebuild their naval stuff, even if it's like the first thing that you pick off with dragons or whatever you got pre-placed. Like you just walk up and destroy their transports and their shipyards, and all of a sudden they'll still be returning to their oil to their refineries or whatever they're called, and they still will not ever rebuild their shipyards. So like that's an example where the AI just functionally does not work when it comes to these mechanics. And of course they never use demo squads ever. There's certain units that they never use. So
I don't think you face them ever in the campaign.
No, they never used them.
Point. Yeah, like even as pre-placed units, they don't exist. They're just for your own use only.
Yeah, and that's how you know you have a gimmick. That's how you know you have something that's not properly implemented into the game state. When something that is there that is only used by the player and the AI never uses it, which is like Nidus canals in Zerg, for example.
Yeah. And I think that sums up the gameplay. I would say again, it's a really old game, so I am willing to carry some slack when it comes to some of its failures. But now we have to move on to the expansion level design, and we already talked a little bit about it. But again, like the fact that they didn't have any new scripts, they didn't have any new units. They only had some heroes. Which actually, enemy heroes only show up in the very last orc mission, whereas in the human mission you never face enemy heroes, as far as I know. And again, the fact that all the missions in the expansion essentially revolve around KTUs really highlights why you shouldn't do that. Like it highlights why the early game is important. It highlights why you shouldn't have enemy bases that are filled with fucking 40 cannon towers behind walls that you have absolutely no way of interacting with, because the enemy is just going to defend them using the spinning maneuver and healing, which is going to make it any sort of approach impossible unless you, in the very first game, you go with one catapult. Like the very few units you're given, you actually have to micro them insanely well to destroy the enemy castle, which they start off before they can actually build any army, which is what you had to do in one of the Orc missions, if you recall. You actually had to try several times, save scamming a lot, because it was the only way to do it. You had to destroy several towers and then the town hall before they actually were able to build an army. If they did that, they would just have annihilated you, because they just start with way more than you do. Like, just the fact that you don't even have a base, they start with a castle, is really, really indicative of how much of a lack of real gameplay there is. It's basically just made to be frustrating instead of being made to be challenging or interesting or fair in any way. Like, I feel like the original game definitely suffered from this way less, especially the human campaign. Like the Orc campaign does some really insane shit. Like the hero peasant, the hero peon, sorry, mission,
Yes.
where they had this insane cross-shaped base on a fucking island with only a single access point, and then 5 billion towers everywhere, and they did not even do anything. They just sat there doing nothing. But for the most part, the original game doesn't really have too much of this. They actually do have situations where the AI starts off with pretty much the same stuff that you do, except that they're quite far away. So by the time you get there, they will have more, which makes sense, I guess. But yeah, in the expansion, like the expansion is definitely a very good example of what not to do in a campaign. And
Right.
again, I'm going to bring up the comparison with Insurrection once again here, because I feel like the mistakes they did, or well, the flawed design decisions they decided to pursue, were pretty much the same in both cases. Like they just have pre-placed defenses everywhere. They just have your expansions lock away. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that was an issue in the last Zerg Insurrection mission, where you basically couldn't get any gas because it was just hidden behind 5 billion pre-placed defenses. And yeah, like it's such an easy blueprint to see just what is wrong with such a design, where you're not allowing pretty much any form of expression whatsoever. You only have to do the quick time event, but because of random damage, you are not actually able to do it in any meaningful way, because it's just basically based on the roll of the dice. It's based on how the AI is going to spin at a specific time. So it's not even a puzzle, really. It's basically just throw your dick at the wall until something happens. I don't even know how else to describe it. Like
Yeah.
the fact that random damage in a game like this works the way it does, on top of the quick time events in the expansion, is just really the ultimate mix for what you should not have in your fucking game, essentially. Like the fact that I'm pretty sure the skeleton, or I don't remember if it was the peon or whatever, I think it did from 1 to 10 damage, which is a massive difference. Like, how can you have such an insane random damage difference? As well as for the heavy ship, the catapult especially.
Yeah, it's like 40 to 80 or something.
Yeah. Like, that's really a
Or
deadly
10
mix.
to 80. I don't know. It's something ridiculous.
A deadly mix of quick time events and random damage, which actually makes perfect execution impossible.
Yeah,
I don't know if,
I've always
if you have any...
felt that way about randomized materials. Any sort of mechanic that is based in randomness or has a significant element of it based in randomness is always going to remove skill from the equation in some way or another. Like, it might, to different degrees, obviously, but you can't control for luck. That's literally something that's impossible to do. So because you can't control for luck, you can't take full credit over whether or not you succeeded or failed. And I always want my failures and my successes to be something where I earned them and it wasn't just handed to me by luck. So that is a pretty annoying element of Warcraft 2 in general, and as well as, of course, the previous title. With Warcraft 2's expansion, I think the problem is that the level design definitely exacerbated a huge portion of the issues that we already observed when it comes to analyzing the base game, because of the fact that they didn't end up rewriting any AI or adding any new units or making any balance changes. They just had a couple of heroes that, admittedly, like the hero Death Knight was actually fairly useful, but he was pretty much the only one. Like, the rest of them were only useful in very niche scenarios or just as meat shields, like heavier, like stat balls, basically.
Yeah, but sometimes they actually made things worse, like in the famous human mission, the third one, which took like 2 hours to beat. Whereas the hero actually ended up dying so many times that it was actually more annoying than useful to use for most of the time.
Yeah, that's the one that we had you try to play at some point, I believe.
Yeah.
That was quite the disaster, because you have to tech up to heal him, and at least that's more than you can say about the orcs. Like, obviously the orc heroes can't be healed, but unless they are the Death Knight. But that's another thing, is like a lot of the mechanics of the game I didn't learn until the expansion, just like healing with Death Coil or anything like that. And like, I guess it's cool that I was able to learn those things, but at the same time, you'd think tooltips would have been invented by now. I don't know what the fuck they were thinking. So information control is poor, on top of the game being really annoying and random, and on top of the fact that the AI and the levels were designed in such a way that they were going to just maximize how much effort you had to put in to break them, but not in a way where you had to solve them like just think of the way that we actually won most of those missions. It goes back to grounding them and in naval missions where you lock up the lock off their ability to actually attack you unless they're going to use like one griffin at a time or something, by destroying all their vessels and like the transport ships in their shipyards, because then they don't rebuild them. So like you're just gimmicking them. It's the same fucking thing as if you like broke the AI in one of the Warcraft 3 missions by destroying their base at the beginning or something, like what happened with Mesk's run with the final Night Elf mission in the base game. Just crazy shit. So I don't know, man. I think the whole idea behind it is like they're trying to stop the player from being able to win early, but yet they would have to try really hard and be good enough to win early. And so they're taking away a potential skill-based expression of the how good they are at the game. They're taking away that potential. They're taking away the ability for you to interact with the AI at all in the early game, and making it so that the only way that you can really win is by suffering a lot. And that's not fun, but it's also not skill testing. So it's not enticing for the casual player, and it's not enticing for the hardcore player. It's just shit. So
yeah, it's no man's land.
Exactly, yeah. A deadly mix, like you said.
But yeah, I think that's most of the gameplay and level design concepts pretty much well analyzed. I don't know what else we could talk about. Maybe we can analyze the graphics and the sounds. But
yeah, we can close out with the more aesthetic elements. I think we talked a little bit about this. You said that you actually appreciated the aesthetic of the buildings. I think that the perspective being top down really ruins any ability for me to enjoy it. It might just be that I've been quote unquote spoiled by looking at more isometric games, but I think isometric games will always look better. And of course, it is a 2D game, so it has that in its favor. But I also thought that the game was kind of hard to read a lot of the time, because they would actually, more effort than I thought they would go through. They did change the graphics depending on the tile set, which is interesting. Stuff that I would like to do in my own RTSs within reason. But a lot of those changes made it really difficult to see. And even if you were just looking at the same set of graphics. I think it was mostly the minimap,
though. Like, if I remember correctly, it was mostly the minimap giving you trouble.
Yeah,
like, some of the player
difficult.
colors were really hard to see on the maps, especially the desert maps where the red color was completely unintelligible. Like, you could not see anything. Yeah. That was really one of the worst aspects, because you have no way of seeing the enemy army coming.
Yeah, well, I think my heroes in that mission were in like the final orc mission for the expansion were also of some psychotic color that I wouldn't be able to pick out, because that was also dumb. But I think that generally the minimap was definitely like a sore spot, but unlike in Warcraft 1, where the graphics for the buildings were unintelligible, like that you couldn't tell what they were, they were hard to tell differently. Like, you couldn't really say, oh, this is a barracks and this is a farm or whatever, like, because they were all like fucking like similar looking. The graphics in Warcraft 2 seem to go the other way in some ways, where the proportions and like the shapes that they are so confusing to the eye, because they're not like normal at all. They don't really look like anything immediately.
Yeah, they basically went for a very abstract style, I guess.
And because of that, I feel like it's really hard to even like observe what that structure is. Like, it takes you a second to process it. For me, that's what happened. Whereas obviously, like, it's really hard to confuse a barracks with a castle, or a barracks with a lumber mill or something like that. Like, they do have distinct shapes now, but it's just that the shapes are so distinct from anything that you would normally see in a game or in real life or anything. Like, proportionally, they don't really look like they. Maybe also the perspective being top down also may have intercepted the ability to look at it and say like, oh yeah, that stands out from the environment or whatever. And then you add that to the fact that they have reskins on different tile sets, and it does make it a little bit more challenging to immediately identify what you're looking at. It wasn't really that big of a deal. I think the biggest issue was the fact that the towers looked so similar, and yet they were significantly different in terms of how impactful they were. But most of the time you just use siege weapons anyway, so you kind of negated the issues behind that. But I will admit that I don't think I commented on this too much during the playthrough, but even in the last video that we played the game in, I was still not able to immediately identify what was a cannon tower and what was a guard tower, what was an unupgraded tower.
Towers are definitely the worst about that. And this is actually one area where in Warcraft 3, like for the humans, the guard tower and the cannon tower actually look radically different, so you can immediately tell them apart. So at least that is one improvement. One. Not 3, but 1.
Well, they have lumber as well. That was an improvement. I don't know if they get a 3.
Yeah.
I don't think so. But as far as the sounds are concerned, like that you were mentioning, I think in general, it wasn't as bad as like one of the Command and Conquer games where we were getting audio globally, but it did have a similar kind of issue.
That was like a bug of sorts. Yeah, that's one in Red 1.
Right, yeah. So like,
we never managed to fix that, unfortunately.
We still had a similar issue with this game. Of course, you watched mostly with sound off, so I don't know if you have had the same experience, but for me it was like I was hearing like clanging of metal, like the grunt attacking a footman or something. Like I was hearing that, and it was sounding pretty loud, even though it was like halfway across the map. So that's just probably an issue of me adapting to like how far away that actually is, because I'm so used to games that typically, like StarCraft, typically is the basis for a lot of that. I feel like at least it's not too different from most other RTS games. Don't have that different of a range for their sounds as from StarCraft. So this game was much wider than that in terms of the range, and so it was a little bit confusing. But I also felt like they reused the same sounds way too much. So.
Right, yeah.
Like archers, guard towers, and I think axe throwers
like
as well.
The explosion especially, like the catapult explosion sound is the exact same one as the mage fireball, as the dragon attack, as the Gryphon attack, as the heavy sheep attack. Like that definitely...
As the ballista as well. So like you don't even know which race is attacking you if you're in some weird free-for-all, which admittedly didn't happen too often, but it would be nice to know, like, I'm orc, I'm fighting human, I hear a ballista sound instead of a catapult sound. I know it's not my catapults attacking, I know I'm being attacked by a ballista. Like, that makes way more sense, and then, of course, instead it just blows up, even though they're ostensibly shooting a fucking bolt at you or something from a ballista. They're not catapulting you, so whatever. But that was like another thing, is just the audio readability of stuff. There's way too many reused sound effects.
Yeah, definitely. But like I don't really have any more points I can think of. If you have anything else you want to close the review on.
I mean, if the game's levels had been better, I definitely would have enjoyed my time with the game more, but it seems like an unfair thing to say, or a pointless thing to say, because of course that's true for literally any game, theoretically. I think in this case it was more than the game state was better than what you would believe just by playing. For sure, a lot of the issues with the mechanics, the sound cues, the visuals being a little hard when you're not familiar with them, the spell system being really, really dumb. There's a lot of problems with it. It's very, very far from perfect. It's very, very far from even ideal. But it was by far and away better than the other two games. And it was like in the franchise, obviously Warcraft 1 and Warcraft 3. And it was I don't know. I guess this technically also is a glass ceiling, just like StarCraft's the glass ceiling of all RTS, in my opinion. You have Warcraft 2 as the glass ceiling of Warcraft games. I don't think it'll ever get better, unfortunately, but I guess we'll wait and see. The problem is that it was the last 2D Warcraft game, and with that, all hopes of a superior title disappeared.
There's some clones like being made lately, and even back then, so maybe those could have some interesting stuff going on. But we'll see if and when we play those. That will be a different review, a different year, even. Like, we'll see.
Most likely, yeah. So.
And, I can only end this by saying that if you really are curious about the history of the RTS genre, and if you want to play this game because you find the theme interesting, or just the fact that you want to play one of the earliest titles, my advice would be to probably only play the human campaign from the original game. And maybe if you really, really want more, then just play the orc campaign from that, and then ignore the expansion completely. And then maybe just play a few skirmish games or whatever. Like, definitely do not play the expansion. It's absolutely terrible. It doesn't have anything going on for it.
Yeah, the thing is, people say the expansion is like regaled as having a lot of difficulty, and they're like, "Oh, only true gamers will be able to win this." But it's just sadists. It's just people who don't give a fuck that they're having their time colossally wasted. So yeah, I would also echo that.
Yeah, as will the police, of course, because they are here to arrest executive media. And that's pretty much all I have to say about Warcraft 2. I hope you guys enjoyed the playthrough. I hope you saw the Warcraft Collective and you were inspired to rebel against Blizzard and other evil corporations, forcing workers to do that. So yeah, that's it for me. I don't know if you have any final thoughts, but
no, I'm getting arrested. That's it.
Yeah. So
bye.
Bye.